Image a man stands at the altar. Everyone's smiling, everyone's celebrating, and in that exact moment, without knowing it, he's signing away everything that made him dangerous. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who saw through society's most beautiful lies, warned us about this trap over 150 years ago. He wrote something that still sends chills down my spine. Marrying means to have one's rights and double one's duties. But here's what nobody tells you about that quote. He wasn't being pessimistic, he was being accurate. Right now, as you're watching this, there are men walking into marriages thinking they're choosing love, thinking they're building a future, thinking they're doing what successful men do. And they have absolutely no idea that they just traded their potential for a prison cell made of obligations. The bars are invisible, the chains are called responsibilities, and the worst part is that you'll defend your own cage. You'll call it maturity, growth, commitment. But Schopenhauer saw what you can't see yet, that marriage isn't about love at all. It's about control. Stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about relationships, success, and what it actually means to be a complete man. By the end of this video, you'll never look at marriage the same way again, and more importantly, you'll never look at yourself the same way either. Schopenhauer spent his entire life studying human nature, dissecting our motivations, exposing our self-deceptions, and what he discovered about marriage was so brutal, so uncomfortably true, that society has spent centuries trying to bury it under romance novels and wedding ceremonies. He wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free." Think about that for a second. Really think about it. When was the last time you made a major decision completely alone, without considering what someone else would think, without filtering it through another person's fears, expectations, or limitations? If you're married, the answer is probably never. And that's exactly the point. Marriage doesn't just limit your choices. It fundamentally changes who you are at your core. You stop being an individual and become half of something else. You stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "What do we need?" You stop creating your own path and start negotiating every step with someone who has their own agenda, their own fears, their own need to keep you predictable. Here's the first brutal truth that Schopenhauer understood better than anyone. Marriage is biological manipulation disguised as romance. Listen to his exact words. All love, in the usual sense of the term, is rooted in the sexual impulse alone. This isn't cynicism. This is clarity. That feeling you call love, that overwhelming sensation that you can't live without her, that desperate need to lock down a relationship. That's not your heart talking. That's your DNA. Your genes don't care about your happiness, your dreams, or your potential. They care about one thing: replication. And marriage is the social structure designed to ensure that replication happens within controllable, predictable bounds. Think about every love story you've ever heard. The overwhelming passion, the can't eat, can't sleep obsession, the feeling that this person completes you. Schopenhauer would tell you that's nature's trick, a temporary insanity designed to get you to commit before your rational mind can stop you. He called it the will to life, a blind, insatiable force that uses your emotions as puppets to achieve its reproductive goals. And here's what's terrifying about this. The intensity of that feeling makes you think it's real, profound, meaningful. But it's just chemistry, hormones flooding your brain to override your better judgment. The second brutal truth hits even harder. Marriage transforms your energy from creation to maintenance. Schopenhauer observed that genius requires solitude, that great works emerge from undivided attention, that revolutionary thinking happens when your mind belongs entirely to itself. But marriage fractures that attention into 1,000 pieces. Suddenly, you're not just pursuing your vision, you're managing someone else's emotions, navigating their moods, processing their day, solving their problems. Your mental energy, which could have been directed toward building something extraordinary, gets siphoned into relationship maintenance. Think about the married men you know. Really think about them. How many are doing something genuinely interesting with their lives? How many are building empires, creating art, pushing boundaries, changing their fields? Now think about the single men who've remained focused, obsessed, devoted to their craft. Notice the difference? It's not coincidence. It's not that marriage attracts mediocre men. It's that marriage creates mediocrity by dividing your focus. Schopenhauer himself never married, lived alone with his beloved poodle, and produced philosophical works that still shape how we understand human nature today. Was that despite his solitude or because of it? The third brutal truth destroys the romantic fantasy entirely. Marriage is a contract where you promise to be predictable. Think about wedding vows. What are you actually promising? To forsake all others, to stay together, to remain constant. You're literally vowing to never change in ways that might threaten the relationship. But here's what Schopenhauer understood about human nature. Growth requires change. Transformation requires destruction of your old self. Greatness requires becoming someone you currently can't even imagine. Marriage asks you to stop that process, to become fixed, stable, reliable. The married man can't pivot his entire life based on a breakthrough insight, can't move to another country on a whim, can't pour everything into a risky venture that might fail. He has to consider her feelings, her career, her comfort, her need for security. Every decision gets filtered through the lens of how will this affect my partner, which really means how will this affect my relationship's stability. And stability, Schopenhauer knew, is the enemy of greatness. The comfortable man doesn't create revolutions, he maintains systems. The predictable man doesn't challenge assumptions, he reinforces them. The fourth brutal truth cuts to the psychological core. Marriage makes you dependent on external validation. Schopenhauer wrote extensively about the difference between satisfaction that comes from within versus satisfaction derived from others' opinions. The unmarried man who has mastered himself generates his own sense of worth, his own meaning, his own validation. But the married man becomes psychologically dependent on his partner's approval. Her mood becomes his emotional weather. Her opinion becomes his measure of success. Her satisfaction becomes his responsibility. This creates what Schopenhauer called a fundamental unfreedom, where your emotional state is hostage to someone else's internal experience. You can't be happy when she's unhappy, can't feel successful when she's critical, can't find peace when she's anxious. Your inner world becomes dictated by external circumstances completely outside your control. And here's the trap within the trap. The more emotionally dependent you become, the more you lose yourself, which makes you less attractive, which creates more relationship problems, which makes you try harder to please her, which makes you lose yourself even more. It's a death spiral that Schopenhauer observed destroying countless men who thought marriage would complete them. The fifth brutal truth reveals the economic dimension of this trap. Marriage is a system that redirects your resources away from your potential. Schopenhauer lived modestly, not because he was poor, but because he understood that wealth spent on impressing others or maintaining status was wealth stolen from intellectual and creative pursuits. But marriage demands consumption, the bigger house to accommodate a family, the nicer car to signal provider status, the expensive vacations to keep the relationship fresh, the endless purchases to maintain a lifestyle that someone else considers appropriate. Your money, which could have bought you time to think, space to create, freedom to experiment, gets locked into mortgages and obligations. And it's not just financial resources, it's your time, your energy, your attention, all redirected away from what Schopenhauer considered the highest human pursuits: philosophy, art, deep thinking, authentic self-development. The married man comes home exhausted from work, and instead of having hours to read, write, think, and create, he has to engage in relationship maintenance, domestic responsibilities, emotional processing. His evenings, which could have been devoted to becoming extraordinary, are spent being ordinary. The sixth brutal truth exposes the social dimension. Marriage is how society tames dangerous men. Schopenhauer understood that society fears the independent man, the one who doesn't need its approval, doesn't follow its rules, doesn't play its games. But how do you control such a man? You can't force him. He'll rebel. You can't threaten him. He has nothing to lose. The solution is brilliant in its cruelty. You make him voluntarily give up his independence by convincing him it's what he wants. Marriage is that mechanism. The dangerous man, the one with revolutionary ideas and the freedom to pursue them, becomes the domesticated man with a mortgage, kids, and responsibilities. He can't take risks anymore, can't challenge powerful institutions, can't say uncomfortable truths, because he has people depending on him. Society doesn't need to silence him. His obligations do it automatically. And here's the genius of this system. He thinks he chose it. He thinks getting married was his decision, that becoming responsible was maturity, that trading his dangerous potential for domestic stability was growth. But Schopenhauer would ask, who benefits from your domestication? Not you. You gained responsibilities and lost possibilities. Society gained another controllable, predictable, harmless man who will work his job, pay his taxes, and never become the threat he could have been. The seventh brutal truth strikes at identity itself. Marriage forces you to live for someone else's expectations. Schopenhauer wrote about the fundamental difference between living for yourself versus living for others' opinions. The authentic man creates his own values, pursues his own vision, measures success by his own standards. But marriage inherently requires you to consider another person's expectations in every decision. What starts as healthy consideration gradually becomes the lens through which you see yourself. You stop asking, am I becoming who I want to be, and start asking, am I being a good husband, a good provider, a good partner? These roles, however noble they sound, aren't your authentic self. They're performances of what others expect. And the more you perform these roles, the more you forget who you actually are beneath them. Schopenhauer observed this happening to men who were once vibrant, interesting, alive with possibilities, watching them gradually fade into generic husband-father figures who all looked the same, talked the same, made the same safe choices. The tragedy isn't that they became bad people. It's that they became nobody in particular, interchangeable parts in society's machine. And what makes this even more brutal is that they defend this transformation. They call it growing up, becoming mature, learning what really matters. But Schopenhauer would say they're defending their own diminishment because admitting they betrayed themselves would be too painful to face. The eighth brutal truth reveals the hidden resentment that poisons marriages from within. You will blame each other for the dreams you didn't pursue. Schopenhauer understood that humans are masters of self-deception. We convince ourselves that our choices were noble, necessary, mature. But the unconscious mind knows the truth. It knows what you sacrificed, what you gave up, what you could have become. And that knowledge festers into resentment. The husband who gave up his business dream to take a stable corporate job for the family will resent his wife every time that job makes him miserable, even if he never admits it, even if he thinks he's moved past it. The man who stopped traveling, stopped creating, stopped taking risks because he had a family to support will feel that loss every time he sees someone else living freely. And here's what makes this particularly brutal. You can't even express this resentment honestly, because you chose it. You agreed to it. Society says you should be grateful for your family. So the resentment goes underground, emerging as passive aggression, emotional distance, criticism over small things, a general sense of disappointment that neither partner can quite name. Schopenhauer observed countless marriages where both partners were quietly bitter, both feeling they'd given up too much, both believing the other didn't appreciate their sacrifices enough. And the worst part is that this resentment is built into the structure of marriage itself. When you tie two people's fates together, when you make one person's choices dependent on another's approval, when you create a system where pursuing your authentic path means potentially destroying someone else's security, you've created a recipe for mutual resentment. The man resents the obligations that killed his dreams. The woman resents that he resents them. Both are trapped in a dynamic where honesty would destroy the relationship, so they maintain a performance of contentment while slowly dying inside. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he said that marrying means doubling your duties. It's not just the practical obligations. It's the emotional burden of managing someone else's expectations of you while suppressing your own authentic desires. And that burden, over decades, crushes the spirit of even the strongest men. The ninth and final brutal truth is the one Schopenhauer considered most important. Marriage prevents you from ever truly knowing yourself. He wrote extensively about the necessity of solitude for self-knowledge, about how we only discover who we actually are when we're alone with ourselves, without the distorting mirror of others' perceptions. But marriage makes sustained solitude nearly impossible. You're constantly in relationship mode, constantly managing how you're perceived, constantly adjusting your behavior based on someone else's reactions. This means you never get the space to ask the fundamental questions that Schopenhauer considered essential for a meaningful life. Who am I beneath all these roles? What do I actually want versus what I've been conditioned to want? What are my authentic values versus the values I've adopted to fit into this relationship? These questions require extended periods of deep solitude, of sitting with yourself without distraction or obligation, of facing your own mind without the buffer of another person's presence. The married man rarely gets this opportunity. His rare moments alone are filled with tasks, responsibilities, or guilt about not being present with his family. He never gets to experience what Schopenhauer called the privilege of solitude, that unique state where you can hear your own thoughts clearly, feel your own desires authentically, understand your own nature deeply. Instead, he lives his entire life defined by his relationship to others. He's a husband, a father, a provider, but he never discovers what he might have been if he'd belonged entirely to himself. And here's the devastating irony that Schopenhauer pointed out. Most men only realize what they've lost after it's too late. After decades of marriage, when they look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. When they realize they've spent their entire life being who others needed them to be, instead of discovering who they actually were. Now here's what Schopenhauer would ask you, and this is the question that changes everything. Can you look at your life, your choices, your relationships, and honestly say you're living authentically, or are you performing a role that society wrote for you? Because there's a massive difference between choosing marriage from a place of completeness and wholeness versus choosing it from fear of being alone, need for validation, or pressure to conform. Schopenhauer wasn't against relationships between men and women. He was against the lie that you need another person to be complete. He was against the social programming that tells you marriage is mandatory for a meaningful life. He was against the system that uses your natural desires against you to trap you in obligations that serve society but diminish you. The man who understands these 9 brutal truths doesn't necessarily avoid marriage entirely, but he approaches it completely differently. He builds himself first, becomes complete within himself, creates his own meaning and purpose. Then, if he chooses partnership, he chooses it from strength rather than weakness, from abundance rather than scarcity, from authentic desire rather than social pressure. This man can walk away if the relationship stops serving his authentic development. This man doesn't lose himself in the relationship because he knows exactly who he is outside of it. This man doesn't resent his partner because he never sacrificed his essential self to be with her. He chose consciously, fully aware of the trade-offs, clear about his priorities, honest about his values. But most men never reach this level of self-awareness. They sleepwalk into marriage because everyone else is doing it, because their girlfriend is pressuring them, because they hit a certain age and think it's time, because they're afraid of being alone, because they want to prove they're capable of commitment, because they need someone to make them feel valuable. And then they spend the next 30 years wondering why they feel empty, trapped, resentful, diminished. Schopenhauer's philosophy offers a way out, not necessarily out of marriage, but out of the unconscious living that makes marriage a trap. It starts with radical honesty about your motivations. Why do you actually want to get married? Strip away the romantic language, the social expectations, the fear of judgment. What's really driving this choice? If you can't answer that question with brutal honesty, you're not ready to make a decision this consequential. It continues with developing what Schopenhauer called the art of not needing others. This doesn't mean becoming cold or isolated. It means building such a rich inner life, such genuine self-sufficiency, such authentic contentment with your own company, that you genuinely don't need another person to feel complete. From that place of not needing, you can actually choose freely. Your choices aren't driven by desperation, fear, or social pressure. They're driven by authentic desire for genuine partnership that enhances rather than completes you. Schopenhauer also understood something that most modern people have forgotten. Suffering is an inherent part of existence, and trying to escape it through marriage often just creates different, more complicated forms of suffering. The single man suffers from loneliness, uncertainty, social judgment. The married man suffers from obligation, compromise, loss of freedom. Neither path eliminates suffering. The question is, which suffering serves your development, and which suffering diminishes you? For some men, the suffering of marriage, the challenge of maintaining a relationship while pursuing excellence, creates growth. For other men, that same suffering destroys their potential and leaves them bitter shells of who they could have been. Schopenhauer would say that knowing yourself well enough to understand which category you fall into is perhaps the most important self-knowledge you can possess. But most men never acquire this knowledge because they never create the solitude necessary to discover it. They go from their parents' house to college to living with a girlfriend to marriage without ever spending significant time alone with themselves. They never discover if they can be happy alone, if they can create meaning independently, if they can build a rich life without the constant presence of others. The men who do take that time, who spend years developing themselves in solitude, who build businesses or create art or pursue mastery while living alone, these men develop something that Schopenhauer considered invaluable: immunity to social pressure. They've proven to themselves that they can thrive independently. This means when they consider marriage, they're not doing it from weakness or neediness. They're choosing it consciously, fully aware that they'd be fine without it. This fundamentally changes the power dynamic in relationships. The man who doesn't need marriage has all the negotiating power. He can set boundaries, maintain his essential nature, refuse compromises that would diminish him. The woman in such a relationship knows she's with a man who chose her, not a man who needed her. And paradoxically, this often creates healthier relationships than marriages built on mutual neediness. But here's what Schopenhauer observed that still holds true today. Most women don't actually want this kind of man. They say they do. They claim they respect independence and strength. But what they actually want, what society has trained them to want, is a man they can domesticate, a man who will sacrifice his essential nature to prove his commitment, a man who needs them enough to become controllable. The truly independent man, the one who has integrated Schopenhauer's insights, makes most women uncomfortable because he can't be manipulated through guilt, controlled through emotional pressure, or domesticated through obligation. This creates a paradox that Schopenhauer wrestled with throughout his life. The very qualities that make you most yourself are often the qualities that make you least compatible with traditional marriage. Your independence threatens her need for security. Your devotion to your work triggers her need for attention. Your comfort with solitude feels like rejection of her company. Your unwillingness to compromise your essential nature seems like unwillingness to commit. So you face a choice that Schopenhauer himself faced. Do you modify yourself to become marriageable? Or do you remain authentically yourself and accept that traditional marriage might not be compatible with who you are? Most men choose the first option without even realizing they're choosing. They gradually sand down their rough edges, compromise their vision, diminish their intensity, all to become the kind of safe, predictable man that women feel comfortable marrying. And they call this maturity, growth, learning to be a good partner. But Schopenhauer would call it self-betrayal, the gradual suicide of your authentic self in service of social acceptability. He'd ask, at what point does compromising to maintain a relationship become compromising yourself out of existence? At what point does being a good partner require you to be a bad version of yourself? These aren't easy questions, and Schopenhauer didn't offer easy answers. What he offered was clarity, the brutal honesty to see marriage without the romantic distortions that society uses to sell it. Marriage isn't about love, it's about biology, social control, and economic structure. That doesn't make it evil, but it does make it something you should approach with eyes wide open, rather than heart full of romantic illusions. The 9 brutal truths I've shared aren't designed to make you avoid marriage entirely. They're designed to wake you up, to make you question assumptions you've never questioned, to force you to examine your motivations with uncomfortable honesty. Because whether you choose marriage or not, that choice should be conscious, informed, authentic. It should be your choice, not society's programming running on autopilot. Schopenhauer lived and died alone, and his legacy has outlasted millions of marriages that seemed so important in their time. Does that mean his path was right? Not necessarily. but it means his path was authentic to who he was, and that authenticity produced work that still matters today. The question isn't whether you should follow Schopenhauer's path exactly. The question is whether you have the courage to discover and follow your own authentic path, regardless of where it leads. Everything you just learned changes how you see relationships forever, and thousands of men are waking up to these truths right now. Write in the comments, "I choose authenticity over conformity," because when you declare this publicly, something shifts inside you. You're no longer just learning, you're committing. You're joining men who refuse to sleepwalk through life, who demand truth over comfortable lies, who value authentic living over social approval. Your comment becomes your stake in the ground, your public declaration that you're done being who others expect and ready to discover who you actually are. This channel exists for men like you, men who think deeply, question everything, refuse easy answers. Subscribing means you're serious about this journey, that you want more uncomfortable truths that shatter illusions and reveal reality. Hit that subscribe button because this conversation doesn't end here. Every video goes deeper, exposes another layer of social programming, provides another tool for authentic living. And smash that like button, because it tells me you're ready for content that doesn't coddle you, doesn't sell you fantasies, but respects your intelligence enough to give you truth, even when truth is brutal. The men who like this video are the ones who recognize that growth requires discomfort, that wisdom requires destroying your cherished illusions, that freedom requires seeing your chains clearly. You're a part of something important here, a community of men committed to authentic development over social performance. But here's what I need you to understand about what's coming next. Everything you learned in this video, all 9 brutal truths about marriage, they're just the beginning. There's another trap waiting for you, another beautiful lie that society sells to keep you controllable, another system that uses your natural desires against you to extract your potential and leave you empty. What I'm going to reveal in the next video will make this conversation about marriage seem gentle by comparison, because what's coming challenges the deepest assumption you hold about success, about meaning, about what makes life worth living. The next video destroys an illusion so fundamental that most men never even realize they're living inside it. Watch it, and you'll never see your life the same way again. Your entire understanding of what you're working toward, what you're building, what you're sacrificing for, everything shifts. The comfortable lies you've been telling yourself about your choices, they won't survive what's coming. Some men will watch it and feel liberated. Others will feel angry because truth often feels like attack when you've built your identity on illusions. But either way, you'll be changed. You can't unknow what you're about to learn. This is the path of authentic development. Each video strips away another layer of social programming until you're standing naked in front of reality, with nothing left but who you actually are. That's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next video is waiting for you right now, and the man who finishes it will be different from the man who starts it. That's not hype. That's what happens when you stop consuming content that makes you feel good and start consuming truth that makes you grow. I'll see you there.